January 30th, 1945. The Baltic Sea was black with winter, frozen waves rolling beneath a sky heavy with snow. Out on those waters, a massive white ship cut through the storm. The Wilhelm Gustloff, once a proud cruise liner of Nazi Germany, now burdened with desperation. On board were more than 9,000 souls, soldiers, nurses, mothers, infants, the broken remnants of a collapsing empire fleeing the oncoming Red Army. They packed every corridor, every deck, shivering and praying for deliverance. The ship was supposed to carry them to safety. But as night fell, 3 Soviet torpedoes found their mark, and in less than an hour, the sea swallowed nearly everyone aboard. It was the deadliest maritime disaster in history, claiming 6 times more lives than the Titanic, and yet almost no one remembers its name. This is the forgotten tragedy of the Wilhelm Gustloff, a moment when vengeance, survival, and horror collided on the frozen edge of the Second World War. By the winter of 1945, Nazi Germany was disintegrating. The Red Army was sweeping west like a firestorm, burning through East Prussia, Pomerania, and the Baltic coast. Civilians fled in chaos, millions of them, clogging frozen roads with carts, bicycles, and what little they could carry. Villages burned behind them, artillery thundered ahead. For countless Germans, once the conquerors of Europe, the war had turned them into the conquered, the hunted. The Wilhelm Gustloff sat moored in the port of Gotenhafen, modern-day Gdynia, Poland. Once a symbol of Nazi pride, she'd been built in 1937 for luxury cruises under the Strength Through Joy program. But in January 1945, her decks became something else entirely. A floating ark of the desperate. As the Red Army closed in, the Nazi Naval Command ordered Operation Hannibal, the largest maritime evacuation in history. Thousands of ships, from warships to fishing trawlers, were pressed into service to ferry soldiers and refugees across the Baltic to safety in the west. Among them, the Wilhelm Gustloff was the grandest, capable of carrying around 2,000 passengers. On that night, she carried more than 9,000. Civilians stumbled aboard in the freezing dark. Women clutching infants, old men barely able to walk, wounded soldiers in blood-stained uniforms, teenage girls from the Women's Naval Auxiliary. The ship's halls reeked of fear, sweat, and coal smoke. Outside, the Baltic was a frozen graveyard, ice floes grinding like bones beneath the hull. The captain knew the risk. Soviet submarines prowled those waters, but the order came. Sail west now, before the Soviets arrive. The passengers cheered when the ship's engines rumbled to life. For many, it felt like salvation. None knew they were sailing into the heart of the abyss. The Wilhelm Gustloff left port on the afternoon of January 30th, 1945, her decks glazed with frost, her lifeboats frozen stiff in their ropes. The ship's commander, Captain Friedrich Petersen, a veteran of the Merchant Navy, stared out over the grey horizon, aware that every decision he made could condemn thousands. Alongside him stood Lieutenant Wilhelm Zahn, a U-boat officer ordered to oversee the evacuation. Their relationship was tense. One was cautious, the other proud. The cold gnawed at them both. The ship was overcrowded beyond imagination. Corridors meant for a handful of tourists were packed shoulder to shoulder with refugees. Every stairwell was a sea of bodies wrapped in rags and blankets. Mothers tucked babies beneath coats to keep them from freezing. Soldiers, some still clutching rifles, leaned against the walls, hollow-eyed, their faces lit by dim bulbs flickering through the ship's trembling power grid. Somewhere deep below deck, in the engine room, sailors whispered that this ship was cursed. Too many aboard, too much weight, too much noise. A beacon for submarines, one muttered, looking up toward the ceiling as if he could already feel the periscope's gaze cutting through the sea. In the Baltic darkness, Soviet submarine S stalked its prey. Its captain, Alexander Marinsko, was an embittered man, brilliant but reckless, despised by his superiors for drinking and insubordination. Yet on this night, he had a chance to redeem himself. Through his periscope, the massive white liner glowed faintly against the black water, lights still blazing, a luxury ship turned ghost. He didn't know who was aboard. He only saw the enemy's flag. Back aboard the Gustloff, The ship plowed onward through the frozen sea. The captain debated whether to hug the coast for protection or steer into deeper water to avoid the minefields. He finally chose the open sea, a decision that would seal their fate. The passengers below sang hymns and lullabies to drown the sound of the engines. Somewhere, a baby cried. The air was heavy with salt, sweat, and prayer. And out in the deep, the hunter waited. Night descended like a shroud. Snow drifted across the Baltic in ghostly sheets, swallowing the horizon until the sea and sky became one endless void. The Wilhelm Gustloff pushed through it, her hull grinding against ice, her smokestacks belching steam into the frozen dark. Inside, heat radiated from overcrowded rooms. People slept in stairwells, engine compartments, even inside lifeboats still hanging from their davits. The air stank of oil and unwashed bodies, of fear held tight behind clenched teeth. Somewhere, a gramophone played a lullaby for a child who would not see morning. Then, at 9:00 p.m., a small, terrible choice was made. The ship's anti-submarine escort had turned back with engine trouble, leaving the Gustloff to cross the night alone. Captain Peterson, worried about colliding with another German convoy, ordered the ship's navigation lights turned on, bright white beacons cutting across the darkness. It was an act of self-preservation that became a death sentence. Beneath the waves, Captain Alexander Marinsko of the Soviet submarine S was staring through his periscope when those lights flickered on, faint, then unmistakable. A massive liner, lit like a floating city. He locked his sights, heart hammering in the dim red glow of the control room. Around him, the crew moved with ritual precision, the language of war distilled into quiet gestures. Flood the tubes, adjust the angle, steady the gyroscope. At 9:16 p.m., Marinsko whispered the order, fire. 3 torpedoes left their tubes in rapid succession, slicing through the black water, each one a spear of vengeance from a nation burned alive. On the Wilhelm Gustloff, the first explosion hit beneath the bow. A deafening crack split the night. Passengers froze, then chaos erupted. The second torpedo struck midship, near the swimming pool that now held hundreds of naval recruits. The blast shredded steel and flesh alike, a single instant of white-hot annihilation. The third torpedo hit aft where the engines roared. The ship groaned, shuddering as if alive. Lights flickered, then failed. Steam hissed through ruptured pipes. The air filled with screams. Within minutes, the Wilhelm Gustloff began to list to port. Men, women, and children spilled into corridors, stumbling through smoke and darkness. The floor tilted underfoot, sending bodies crashing into walls. Mothers clutched infants, crying for husbands lost below decks. Soldiers tried to reach lifeboats already jammed with the panicked and the dying. Above deck, the wind howled like a living thing. Snow lashed across the tilted deck as sailors hacked at frozen ropes with knives. Lifeboats splintered as they hit the icy water, most capsized instantly. Those who leapt into the sea found themselves encased in death, the freezing brine solidifying breath and blood within seconds. The Wilhelm Gustloff was dying. Her proud white hull dipped beneath the waves, her name swallowed by blackness and fire. Somewhere below, the ship's orchestra, survivors say, tried to play one final song before the deck tilted too far to stand. It took less than 40 minutes for the sea to claim her. And then, in the howling wind and falling snow, silence, broken only by the distant cries of the drowning. The Wilhelm Gustloff was gone, but the sea was still alive, alive with the sound of agony. Thousands thrashed in the black water, the surface a chaos of limbs, debris, and moonlit ice. The Baltic that night was -18 degrees Celsius, cold enough to kill in minutes. Voices rose and fell, then vanished one by one, swallowed by the snow and the waves. Searchlights from distant ships cut weak beams through the darkness, illuminating faces, grey, frozen, eyes wide in disbelief. Mothers clung to infants who were already still. Young sailors, trained for war but not for mercy, screamed for help that would never come. A few clambered onto overturned lifeboats, their skin freezing to the metal as frost formed on their lashes. A witness later said it looked as if the sea itself were on fire, burning not with flame, but with human souls flickering out in the dark. Above, the snow kept falling, soft, almost tender, as if the heavens themselves were trying to bury the horror before dawn could see it. By morning, the Baltic was littered with the dead. Bodies floated in clusters, tangled in ropes and life jackets. The wind carried the smell of fuel and salt and silence. Of the over 9,000 people who boarded the Wilhelm Gustloff, barely 1,200 survived. Entire families were erased, their names lost beneath the ice. The rescuers who arrived hours later, German torpedo boats and fishermen, pulled children frozen solid from the water, their faces peaceful, almost asleep. One sailor wept as he realized he'd lifted the same woman he'd seen laughing on deck hours before. For Captain Marinsko aboard the S-13, the strike was a triumph, the greatest tonnage ever sunk by a Soviet submarine. He wrote in his logbook simply, "Target destroyed." But history would not treat him kindly. The Soviet command, suspicious of his behavior and unmoved by the scale of civilian loss, denied him recognition for decades. His moment of vengeance was buried beneath the moral fog of war. And for the survivors of the Gustloff, survival itself became a curse. They carried that night inside them, the screams, the cold, the image of the ship's lights vanishing beneath the waves. Many never spoke of it again. The war moved on, as wars always do, devouring one tragedy with another. Within months, Berlin would fall. The Third Reich would be ash. But on that frozen sea, a different kind of reckoning had already taken place, not of armies or politics, but of humanity itself. In the endless white silence of the Baltic, the line between innocence and guilt, vengeance and justice, had blurred, until it was as invisible as the horizon itself. In the weeks that followed, the story of the Wilhelm Gustloff drifted into silence, buried beneath the rubble of collapsing empires. Germany, shattered and defeated, had no voice left to mourn its dead. And the Allies, uncovering the full horror of Nazi crimes, had little sympathy for German suffering. The Baltic tragedy became a ghost, too vast to comprehend, too inconvenient to remember. But memory has a way of clinging to the edges of things. Survivors, scattered across Europe, carried the weight of that night in their eyes. Some spoke of it in whispers, of the screaming ice, of the ship's lights still glowing faintly beneath the waves, of the eerie quiet that followed. Others stayed silent for life, unable to bear the guilt of living when so many had not. In the East, the Soviet Union hailed Captain Marinsko as a hero only decades later, after his death, when the Cold War needed legends of vengeance. Yet even his crew had seen the faces in the water. They knew the truth. It wasn't victory they'd witnessed, but annihilation. Historians would later call the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff the Titanic of the East. But that comparison feels too small. The Titanic carried luxury and hubris. The Gustloff carried despair. She wasn't a monument to pride, but a floating refugee camp, a ship filled with the unwanted, the forgotten, the broken. And perhaps that's why history turned away. It didn't fit cleanly into the morality of the war. The victims were civilians, yes, but German. The killer was Soviet, but fighting fascism. There was no side to root for, no easy lesson to draw. Just 9,000 frozen souls suspended between guilt and innocence. For the few who survived, life became an endless echo of that night. One woman recalled waking every winter to the sound of waves crashing and feeling her lungs tighten, as though the sea had never released her. Another man, rescued as a boy, kept a jar of Baltic sand on his windowsill. To remember the color of death, he said. Even today, divers who descend to the wreck say the Wilhelm Gustloff rests in eerie stillness, her hull broken open, her decks scattered with remnants of lives cut short, children's shoes, rusted utensils, porcelain cups. The sea has claimed her, but not her story, because the Wilhelm Gustloff was more than a ship. She was a question whispered to every generation that came after. When does vengeance become cruelty? And how many innocents must drown before history learns to remember them? In that frozen winter of 1945, amid a war built on hate, the Baltic answered in silence. And that silence still stretches, endless and cold, across the sea where 9,000 souls fell unheard, unseen, but never truly gone.